In the last episode, we fully implemented the player data saving system into our game. And in today's episode, we're going to be learning how we can easily manage our players' data by performing changes to it, and then we'll also learn how we can easily replicate this data from the server to the client and keep them in sync. Now, during this episode, you're going to hear me use the word state, which can be thought of exactly as how I would use the word data. These words both mean the same thing in this context, but state is the more commonly used word in professional environments. So if you want to learn more about this general topic, then you can research how state is managed in other areas or other programs. State or data can apply to many contexts. It could be something as simple as, does the player have a specific GUI enabled? Or something more complex like all of the unique information we save and store about each player. The state that we'll be working with today is the player's saved data. Currently, we get this state by using the profile service to pull it from a data store. This means that the data is being obtained and stored as a table on the server side. So we have two goals in today's episode. The first goal is to create an easy way for modifying the player's state, and our second goal is to create an easy way for replicating the player's state and changes from the server side down to the client side. Now, there's many ways that we could modify a player's data, but the method that we'll be going with is by calling a function with a specific action to update the player's state. Now, an action is simply just a table with some information stored inside of it. Each action will effectively provide the function with instructions for what data it should make changes to. Now, I know that might sound very confusing, but don't worry. As we actually go through implementing this, I think it'll be very easy to understand. Now, before we begin even implementing our way of managing state, I want to quickly review how we are currently managing the player state. So, inside of the server script service, inside of the services folder, we have the player data service module that we created last time. Let's go ahead and open this up. And if you look towards the bottom of the onStart function, we can see a little bit down inside of here, after we get the player's profile and we get their data, we can then see that we're actually modifying the coins and increasing them by 1. We can also see that we're updating the player's leader stats as well. So with this method, we're not really doing anything to manage the overall state. Instead, we're effectively directly updating the state from the table that is stored inside of. And that's a perfectly okay way of doing it, but like I just said a little while ago, the way that we're going to be doing it, in my opinion, is a whole lot better. So now that we understand how we are currently managing the state in this regard, let's go ahead and start implementing our new method of handling this. So to begin implementing this method, what we're going to do is we're actually going to go inside of the replicated storage and we're going to create a brand new folder inside of here. This folder is going to be called functions. And the reason that I'm doing this is because how I organize my game is sometimes I just have some functions that I want to use on both the client and the server side, and I'll store those specific functions inside of this folder so that I can easily access them. And with that being said, we're going to go ahead and create a module script inside of this folder, and we'll go ahead and rename this module script to be called update state. And now inside of this module script, we're actually going to delete all of the contents inside of it. Now, the first thing that we want to do inside of here is actually require our player data module script that we created in the last episode, which effectively holds all of our default players' data, and also the player data type, which effectively tells us the structure of what our player data will actually look like. So we're going to create a variable called player data, and to get that module script, we would say require, then we'll say script.parent, which will take us to the functions folder. Then we need to say .parent once again to take us to the replicated storage, and now we can directly access the player data module script. Now that we've gotten that module script, the first thing we want to do inside of here is actually export the player data type that the player data module script is already exporting. This might sound weird, but effectively we're re-exporting this type because it'll allow us to easily reuse this type in other module scripts without those module scripts having to also require the player data module script. Now, I feel like that explanation didn't make it any less confusing, but I think once we actually type it out and you see what we're doing, it might make it easier to understand. So let's go ahead and say export type, and then the name of this type is going to be the exact same name. So we'll say player data, and then we'll set it equal to player data, just like that. So again, the reason that we're doing this is because now anytime the update state module script is required, all of those module scripts which require this module script will have direct access to the player data type that we created in another module script, but those module scripts will not also have to then require the player data module script because we're creating this exact same type inside of here and exporting it as well. So effectively, this is just a really nice convenience and saves us a little bit of time and allows us to not have to re-require this exact same module because we're already doing it inside of here. And now that we've exported that type, the next thing we want to do is create another type. And we're also going to export this as well. So let's go ahead and say export type. And the name of this type is going to be called state action. And what this type is going to be is it's actually going to be a union. And you can think of a union as basically a group of types or multiple types. So for instance, you could have a string union, which we could say test, and then we would use a vertical bar symbol, and then we would say test2, and now this is a union of strings. So it would actually be called a string union, which is basically just multiple different strings that this type could actually be. Now, we're not actually creating a string union. Instead, we're going to create a union of tables. So after my equal symbol, I'm going to hit the enter key, and then I'm going to create my first table by using curly braces. Then I'm going to hit enter, and now we should see our code formatted similar to this. Now, every single table of the state action type is going to have a key value pair, with the key being called action, and then the value of this being a string. Now, for our first action, let's go ahead and create an action for modifying the amount of coins that a player has. What I would call that action is update coins. Then I'm going to use a comma because we're going to add a second key value pair to this table. And now this key value pair is going to be used to specify the amount of coins that we're going to modify the current player's coins by. So for the key, I'm going to say amount, and for the value, I'm going to say number, because of course we would have to pass through a number for the amount of coins that we want to update the player's current coins with. So this is one of our actions right here. Now I'm going to go ahead and create a second action. So after creating our first table, I'm then going to use a vertical bar. Then I'm going to hit enter. Then I'll hit tab, and now we'll create another table by using curly braces once again. Now, once you hit enter, Roblox Studio might format your code a little bit differently. So before I reformat that code, I'm going to finish creating the second type. So for our second table, we're going to go ahead and add the action key once again. And now for our second action, let's go ahead and make an action for updating the amount of gems that a player has. So we're going to call this update gems. Then I'll use a comma once again, and because this is very similar or exactly the same as update coins, we'll also include an amount argument or an amount key value pair inside of here as well, which of course the value would be a number once again. Cool, so now that we finished with creating that second table, I'm going to go ahead and highlight all this code, then hit tab once, and now our code is nicely formatted as we originally wanted. If you hit enter after that, the last curly brace might move to a position that you don't want to, so you might need to fix that again. The reason that may happen is because our formatting doesn't really fit Roblox Studio's standards. But in my opinion, I think this is the nicest way to list out a table union where you're going to have a bunch of tables inside of here, rather than doing it the way that Roblox Studio would prefer. But of course, you can do it either way you want to. It really doesn't matter. This is just sort of a visual thing that, in my opinion, is the nicest way to do it. Cool. So now we've created our state action type, and we've added two actions to it as well. Keep in mind that we'll add new actions here whenever we add more data that we need to manipulate in the future. And now that we've done that, the last thing that we want to do inside of here is actually return a function. Because remember, this is a module script which can be required by other scripts. So we're going to say return, and then we're going to create a function directly right here. Now, this function is going to have two parameters. The first parameter is going to be called player data, which is actually going to be of the player data type. And the second is going to be action, which is of course of the state action type. And now this function will handle changing the data based on the specific action. So of course, whenever we call this function, we'll pass through the player's data from their profile, and then we'll also pass through the specific action that needs to be performed on that data as well. So now, how can we manipulate the player's data based on the specific action provided to us? Well, it's actually really simple. We'll go ahead and use an if statement, and then we'll say if action dot action, and now we'll check what the specific type of action actually is. So if the action is update gems, then what are we going to want to do? Well, what we would want to do is we would go inside of the player's data, and then we would get their gems. Then what we would do is we want to say plus equals to add a specific amount of gems to their current amount of gems. And what amount are we going to add to this? Well, we would use the amount that was passed through to us with the action. And now we're actually updating the amount of gems that the player currently has. But now that's not all we want to do inside of this function, because we need to account for every single action. So we'll then say else if action.action equals update coins. And then what are we going to want to do this time? Well, we would say player data.coins plus equals action.amount, just like that. So this may seem a little bit odd to you, and I don't blame you for feeling that way. But if you're feeling a little bit discouraged from using this method, I would recommend that you give it a little bit more of a try before ruling this out. In my opinion, this is currently my favorite method of handling state. The reason for this is because when we handle the state, since we're doing it all inside of this single module script, this allows us to organize and keep all of those changes inside of the exact same module script so we can easily see what is going on with our state. Now, we are pretty much done inside of this module script, but I want to show you one more thing that we could do. Considering that update gems and update coins pretty much behaves the exact same way, we could actually make a simpler action to handle both of those actions instead of creating two separate ones. So what I'm going to do is add another action to this table. So I'm going to say action, and now for the name of this action, we're going to say update currency. The reason that we're naming the action update currency is because we consider both coins and gems a currency. Then we'll add a new key value pair here that we haven't used before, and that is going to be called currency. And with this, we'll actually specify which currency we want to update. So do we want to update coins, or do we want to update gems? And then we'll include the amount key value pair like we normally do, which of course would be a number. So then I'll go ahead and fix the formatting just like that. And now let's actually implement that brand new action into this function. So we'll then say else if action.action equals update currency, then. And now if it does equal update currency, then what we're going to do is we're going to go inside of the player's data and we're actually going to directly index that with the specific currency. So we would say action.currency. And now that we have that specific currency, we're going to go ahead and add the action.amount to that currency. And now this single line of code is able to handle what these couple lines of code are actually doing as well. Now you can determine what you want to do. I'm going to leave all three of these actions inside of here, because I feel like giving you more options or more of a variety is more helpful than it is hurtful. My own preference is to go with just the update currency action and then delete these other two actions, but I'm going to leave this in here just so that we don't only have a single action. And if you want to delete the other two after we fully finish creating this episode, then you can feel more than welcome to do that. Anyways, now we've actually fully finished with creating this function, so let's go ahead and actually begin using it. I'm going to go ahead and close out of this and return to our player data service. Inside of our player data service, we want to go towards the top of our script. And now we want to go below where we require the player data module. Below here, we want to actually create a variable for the update state module that we just created. So we're going to go ahead and call this update state, and we'll go ahead and require that from inside of the replicated storage, inside of the functions folder, and of course we'll get the update state module script. Now that we've required that, the first thing that we want to do inside of here is actually re-export that state action type that we created inside of the update state module. So we'll go ahead and say export type state action equals update state dot state action. And again, similar to how we re-exported the player data type inside of the update state module script, we're re-exporting the state action type inside of our player data service because it's actually going to be very common for any time the player data service is required by other module scripts to use the player data service and actually create an action and then pass through that action to the player data service to manipulate the player's data. So that's why we're re-exporting the state action type right here. Now that we've done that, let's scroll down a little bit and go in between our onStart function and the create leader stats function and create a brand new one. This function is going to be a part of the shared table and it's going to be called update state. The parameters of this function are going to be a player, and we'll also accept an action as well, which is of course of the state action type. So whenever we call this function to update the player's state and we pass through a specific action, the first thing that we need to do is get the player's profile. So we'll go ahead and create a variable called profile. And to get the player's profile, we index the profiles variable with the specific player. Now, of course, if we're not able to find the profile, then what do we want to do? Well, we'll return end and stop the function right there. And now that we know that we've gotten the player's profile, the only other thing that we actually need to do is use the update state function, which is that module script that we just required. And then we'll pass through profile.data, which is the player's data. And then we need to pass through the specific action as well, which is just the action parameter, which was already given to us from this function. And now that'll directly update the player's state. And now we want to do one more thing inside of this function, and that's after we update the player's state. And now what we want to do is we also want to update the player's leader stats as well to reflect the changes that we've just made to their data. Now, when we use the update state function, that doesn't always mean that we need to update the player's leader stats. So that means what we want to do is we want to check if the action of the action table is update currency. And if it is, then we'll go ahead and update the leader stats. Now, of course, keep in mind that we do have update currency, update gems, and update coins. I'm just going to set this if statement up for update currency. But of course, if you're using one of the other two actions, then you'll also need to change this if statement to accommodate for those as well. Anyways, inside of here, the first thing that we want to do is create a variable called currency. And with this variable, what we want to do is we want to check if the currency of the action is gems. And if it is gems, then we want to actually set this variable to gems with a capital G. Otherwise, we would want to set it to coins with a capital C. And the reason that we're doing that is because when we created the leader stats, we actually named the instance values with a capital C and a capital G. So that's why we need to get those capital letters right here. Anyways, now that we've actually gotten the specific currency, what we're going to do is we're going to say player.leaderstats. Then we'll index that with the specific currency. Then we'll say .value and then we'll set them equal to the profile.data and then index that with the specific action.currency and make sure that that's action.currency and not the currency variable that we just created. So what this function is going to do is every single time it's called, it'll make sure that the player has a profile. If the player does have a profile, we'll go ahead and use the update state module script that we created earlier to use the function and actually perform the update to update their data. And then after we've updated their data, we'll go ahead and update their leader stats to reflect any of those changes by setting it directly to what their data has currently been updated to. So now that we've got this function fully set up, let's go ahead and actually begin using this. And ordinarily, I wouldn't use this inside of its own script, but considering we created a while loop in the last episode where we actually increased the player's coins by 1 every single second, let's go ahead and update all of the logic right here for how we currently update the player's state. So we can actually highlight and then remove all of that code. Now we're just left with a simple for loop as we iterate through all of the players currently in our game. So to begin updating the player state, the first thing that I'm going to do is go ahead and create my action. So I'm going to create a variable called action, and then we'll specify the type of this variable to the state action type that we created earlier. Then we'll go ahead and set the value of this to a brand new table. And now inside of this table, we got to go ahead and add some key value pairs, which are specific to our action. So I'll go ahead and say action, and we'll set this equal to a string. And the action that I want to use is going to be called update currency. Then I'll use a comma, and now we need to specify the specific currency that we want to update. So I want to go ahead and update coins. And then for the last key value pair, we want to go ahead and specify the amount that we want to update the player's currency by. So if we wanted to subtract 1 from their total balance, then we can say -1, or if we just want to increase it by 1 each time, we can just specify 1 just like that. So now I've fully created my state action. The next thing that I have to do is simply use the update state function that we just created. So we'll go ahead and say shared.updateState, we'll pass through the player, and then we'll pass through the action as well. And now that we've done that, let's go ahead and start up our game and see if that's working. So now, once we get into our game, we can actually see that my coins are once again being increased by 1 every single second. So that means that our new way of managing our state is working perfectly. Now, you might be like me, and you might still be looking at this brand new way of managing state, and you still might be wondering, what are the advantages to this? Why is this actually worth using compared to my usual way of handling this? Like I said, in my opinion, this is the best way of managing your state and staying organized. If you guys have followed some of my previous tutorials, such as creating a clicking simulator or different game tutorials like that, you might have seen that I pretty much just make raw modifications to the player's profile data in every other script other than the player data service. But in this tutorial, I haven't even exposed the player's profiles to any other module script. That's just a local variable, and the player's profiles are never shared with any other script that requires this. And like I said, I really prefer doing it this way because it keeps all of our state code in one specific spot. Having most or all of your state management logic centralized in a single module script really helps with organization and makes it a lot easier to debug and prevent side effects from happening. And I can even see people may not be a fan of being restricted to just using the update state function and would rather directly interact with the player's profile data on their own. But in my opinion, it's a much better idea to have one central function as the only function which actually directly interacts with the player's profile data, because again, that prevents you from making a lot of mistakes, having different side effects because you're modifying the player's data from so many different locations and not in a centralized way, like using one specific function. And those are just the reasons that I can tell you right now, because I would say that this has just been one half of this entire video. In the next portion of this episode, we're going to actually be implementing the replication logic so that we can replicate the player's individual data/state directly down to the client so that they have access to that data. And in addition to that, we also want to replicate all of the changes and actions that we perform on the state as well down to the client so that the client can keep that state in sync with what it looks like on the server side. And when it comes to doing that replication, we'll actually be coming back and updating this function as well to handle that replication too. So that's just another advantage to directly using this single function anytime we want to modify the player's state. So now with the second half of the episode, we're going to be primarily talking about the topic of replication. Currently, on the client side, we have no way of accessing the amount of coins that the player currently has because we store all of that information only on the server side. Now, technically, we could rely on number value instances used by the leader stats to get this information, but we can't rely on them for our entire state. Imagine if we added other information to our player's data like settings, and more specifically what settings they have toggled on or off. It would be a very poor decision to store these in value instances like bool value instances to handle replication for us. Now, I'm going to break down our replication system that we're going to be implementing into a couple of parts. Now, using ChatGPT, I made this quick little diagram, so hopefully it helps you understand exactly how we'll be handling the replication. So obviously on the left, we have the client side, and on the right, we have the server side. Of course, on the server side is where we get the player's profile, we actually store and manage all of their data, and we're doing everything related to the player's profile data and information like that right here. Okay, so now looking at the client side, we are going to be using a remote event called start, which the client is going to fire off once it has loaded into the game. We'll use this remote event to communicate that the client is ready to receive their initial state from the server. Then we have a second remote event, which is going to be fired from the server down to the client. And now the set state remote event is only going to be fired in two different scenarios. The first scenario is directly after the player's profile has been loaded. So after the server loads the player's profile, it'll then fire off set state to tell the client, hey, we just got your profile, here's all that information right here. And now the second scenario is after the client has actually fired off that they're ready to receive that information by firing off the start remote event. And now once the set state remote event is fired off, when the server fires that remote event off, it'll actually include the player's initial state in that remote event. So then the client will take that state and store it inside of the module script so that we're actually able to access that state on the client side. Now you might be wondering, why do we have to fire off this start remote event to the server to tell them that we're ready to receive this information? Well, let's go ahead and remove that from the equation for a second. So now when we look at this, the only time that the player's state is replicated down to the client is after the server has been able to load the player's profile. With this method though, we actually run into an edge case where the client may not be ready to actually get that information and then store it somewhere. So because it's possible for the server to fire off that remote event and try to replicate the player's profile data before the client is actually ready to receive it, that could result in the client never receiving their initial state. So that's why we simply use the start remote event to communicate to the server that we're ready to receive it, and then the server knows when to send it, and then we'll actually receive it. Okay, so now after we've actually replicated that initial state from the server down to the client, and the client does actually have the state, what we're then going to do is use one final remote event, which is going to be called update state, and we're going to fire off the update state remote event every single time the player's state has actually been modified on the server side. So just a little bit ago, inside of the player data service, we actually added that update state function. And inside of there, after we perform that update, we'll go ahead and communicate the changes by using the update state remote event and passing through that action that we just used to modify the player's data down to the client. Then once the client receives it, the client will then go ahead and perform the exact same action on the state in order to keep it in sync with the server. Now, I know these visual representations weren't the greatest. I just quickly used ChatGPT to whip these things up. Let me know in the comment section down below if you appreciated these or if you don't feel like they really helped at all. I'm definitely curious for you guys' feedback, and if you'd like to see more resources like this used in the future to help explain different concepts and things that we'll be doing. So to begin implementing a replication system, what we first want to do is go ahead and create the networking. So we're going to have to create some remote events. So we're going to go inside of the replicated storage and we'll create a brand new folder. We'll go ahead and rename this to be called remotes and then create another folder inside of it. We'll then go ahead and rename this folder to be called player data, and then inside of here is where we'll go ahead and create our remote events. Now, the first remote event that we're going to create is going to be called start. Then we'll go ahead and duplicate that, and the next one that we'll create is going to be called set state. Then we'll create one final one, and that one is going to be called update state. And those are all three of the remote events that we're going to create. So with that being said, we can go ahead and collapse the replicated storage. Now, because I kind of just walked us through what we're actually going to do for this replication system, the first thing that I'm going to do is go ahead and update the player data service and implement the replication system in there first. So we'll go inside of the server script service, inside of the services folder, and open up the player data service module. Inside of here, we're going to want to go ahead and create a variable below our update state variable, which is going to be called remotes. And we'll set this to the folder with all those remote events that we just created. So we'll go ahead and say replicated storage.remotes.playerData, just like that. Now that we've created that variable, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and actually create a function between the onStart and update state function. This function is again going to be part of the shared table, and we're going to call this getState. And it's going to have a single parameter, which is going to be the player of the state that we want to actually get. Like I said, it's a very simple function, so the first thing that we're going to do inside of here is create a variable for the player's profile, which we can get from indexing the profiles variable with the specific player. And then if we do actually get the profile, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and return the profile.data just like that. Okay, so now that we've actually created that function, let's go back towards our onStart function. Towards the top of this function is where we actually want to go ahead and begin using our first remote event. The first remote event that we're going to set up is the start remote event. Remember, this is fired from the client side whenever they're ready to receive their initial state. So we're going to say .onServerEvent::connect, create an anonymous function inside of here, And this function is just going to accept the player who actually fired off this remote event. Then inside of this function, we're going to create a variable called state, which is going to be equal to shared.getState, and then we'll pass through the player. Then if we do actually get the state, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and fire off the setState remote event. So we'll say remotes.setState. Then we'll use the fireClient method. We'll fire it off to that specific player, and we'll pass through and provide them with their state. So now we've handled actually listening to the onStart remote event. Now, can you guys remember when the second time was that we would actually use the setState remote event? The other time that we would use this remote event is after the player's profile has been loaded. So to do this, we actually want to go into the createProfile function. And we want to go all the way down towards the bottom of this. And after we actually create their leader stats, we'll go ahead and replicate their state to the client. So we'll go ahead and say remotes.setState, fireClient, we'll pass through the player, and then we'll go ahead and pass through the profile.data just like that. So now we're handling 2 out of 3 of our remote events. The last remote event that we actually have to implement is when we make changes to the player's data. So we'll do that inside of the updateState function. After we call the updateState function, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and fire off the updateState remote event. So we'll go ahead and say fireClient, we'll fire it off to the specific player, and then we'll pass through the action that we used on their state. And now with that being said, we fully implemented the networking on the server side. So we can go ahead and close out of the player data service module, and we can even collapse the server script service because we're done with working inside of there. Next, what we're going to do is go inside of the starter player, inside of the starter player scripts, inside of the controller folder, and we're going to add in a brand new module script to this. We'll go ahead and rename this to be called the state controller. And then of course inside of here, we'll go ahead and create our usual tables. So we've got our shared variable, and then I also want to create our local table as well, just like that. Now, towards the top of our script, the first thing we want to do is create a variable for the replicated storage. And now from inside of the replicated storage, we want to get that update state module script that we created earlier. And we also want to create a variable for the remotes folder as well. So we'll go ahead and create a variable called update state, which is going to be equal to require replicated storage.functions.updateState. And now we'll go ahead and create the remotes variable. So we'll go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the remotes folder, and then we'll go inside of the player data folder. Now the state controller is going to be a little bit similar to the player data service. So one of the first things that we want to do inside of here is actually re-export the state action type. So let's go ahead and do that right now. We'll go ahead and say export type state action equals update state dot state action, just like that. And then we also want to export the player data type as well. So we'll say export type player data equals update state dot player data. Then we're going to go ahead and create a local variable, which is going to be called state, and we want to set this to the type of player data. And now we're not going to set the state variable to anything, but this variable is what we'll actually use for storing the player state that's given to us from the server side. Now, in between where we create the shared table and return it, we're going to go ahead and create a brand new function, which is going to be part of the shared table, and it's going to be called onStart. Now, inside of here is where we want to connect to our remote events. So the first remote event that we're going to connect to is the setState remote event. So we'll say .onClientEvent, connect, and we'll create an anonymous function inside of here. This anonymous function is going to have a single parameter, which is going to be the player's data, which is of course of the player data type. And now whenever this remote event is fired off, all we need to do is actually set the value of the state variable to the player data, which is provided to this remote event. And that is what we'll do to effectively set the initial state. Now, there's some other remote events that we got to listen to as well, like the update state remote event. So we'll say .onClientEvent, connect, create an anonymous function, and the parameter of this function will be an action, which of course would be a state action. Now, the first thing that we want to do with this function is we actually want to make sure that the state has actually been set before we try to update it. So we're going to say if not state, then, and then we'll return end and stop the function right there. But now if we know that we actually have the state, then let's go ahead and perform an update on it. So what we would do is we'll go ahead and use the update state module script that we created earlier. We'll go ahead and pass through the player's actual state, and then we'll go ahead and pass through the action to update it as well. Now, another thing that I almost forgot that we should also include with the update state remote event is we'll actually go ahead and create a bindable event that other module scripts can listen to, which require this controller, and that bindable event will be fired off anytime the player state has actually been updated. So we'll go ahead and say shared.updateState equals instance.new, and then we'll go ahead and create a bindable event. Now, going back inside of where we listen to the update state remote event, after we actually update the player state, we'll then go ahead and fire off the update state bindable event. So we'll go ahead and say fire, and then we'll fire off the specific action, and we'll also include the updated state as well. And there we go. Now, anytime a change has been made to the player state on the server side, it'll be reflected to the client side and the client side will perform that exact action to keep the state in sync with the server side. So now that we've set up both of those remote events, we're now ready to communicate to the server side that, hey, we're ready to receive our data. So we'll go ahead and do that by using the start remote event, and all we have to do is just say fire server. Now, we're pretty much done with this, but there's one last thing that we want to do, and that is creating one more shared function. This function is going to be called getState, and this is actually how all the other module scripts that require the state controller will actually access the state. Now, I'm going to specify the return type of this variable by using a colon after the parentheses of this function, and what this function will actually return is of the player data type. Now, this function is going to be a little bit different than something you might be used to. What we're going to do inside of here is we're going to say while state equals nil, and what this means is that while the state has not been set, what we actually want to do is we want to repeatedly wait until the state has actually been loaded. So we're going to wait 0.01 seconds. And then outside of the while loop, towards the end of the function, what we're going to do is go ahead and return the state variable. And now the reason that we're handling it this way is primarily because of how I script my GUIs on the client side. There's a lot of times when I'm scripting a GUI that I want to directly access the state from the state controller. But when the player's joining the game for the first time and those GUIs are basically being initialized, there's a chance that the state has not actually been loaded down to the client yet. So to allow us to continue to script the GUIs the exact same way that I normally do, and to prevent us from running into any issues, what we're going to do is any script which uses the getState function will basically stall until the state has actually been loaded. And then once the state has been loaded, the script will resume as it normally would. So this while loop is effectively only going to be used for the first couple seconds that the player has joined the game and they don't have access to their state, in order to prevent any issues or things like that where commonly our GUI scripts are trying to access the state before it's actually been replicated down to the client. But like I said, a couple seconds after the player has loaded in, they should actually have their state, and then this while loop will never actually be used once again. Okay, so let's go ahead and test this out. We don't really have anything set up to visualize this actually working, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert some print statements. So inside of where we listen to the set state remote event, I'm going to say the state has been loaded, and then I'll go ahead and print the state. Then inside of where we listen to the update state remote event, I'm going to go ahead and print state has been updated, and then I'll also print the action as well. And now that we've done that, let's go into our game and test this out. So now, once we load into our game, we can actually see the second message that we see as state has been loaded. And then if we look inside of here, we can see what our state actually is on the server side that's now been replicated down to the client side. Then directly after it's been loaded, we can see that it's been updated, and each time we should just see an action for updating the player's currency of coins by 1. And we can see that's repeatedly happen every single time the player's coins is being increased. So we can see that the state controller has been set up perfectly, meaning that the state is being replicated and kept in sync with what it is on the server side. But anyways, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to be it for this episode. As always, if you did enjoy, make sure you smash the like button. Please leave a comment down below letting other people know that it did work. I and they really do appreciate it. It helps everyone out. And as usual, if you want to gain access to all the scripts and the game file that we made during this episode, as well as a ton of other assets, you can visit monster.dev or my Patreon, link down below in the description to both of these. You can gain access to a ton of assets to easily create your next Roblox game, as well as support me in creating all the content that I create. Anyways, with all that being said, I hope that you guys have a great day, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.